Local productions on QTV are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello everyone, welcome to Junia Doan's The Spark. I'm Junia Doan and thank you for joining us. I'm here today with Scott Seeburger, former Dial Corning Community Relations Specialist and Chair of the Midland County Historical Society. Welcome, Scott. Scott, you've talked to me over the times about your interest in Tom McCoy. Would you care to share what you're interested in and what you know about him?
Yes, Tim McCoy, and this goes back to my family history. My family, first of all, owned one of the first two movie houses in downtown Midland.
When was that?
This would have been 1922, the start of it. Now, the Cassidy family, if you're familiar with the history of Midland, owned movie houses from 1916 through into the 1970s. They might have even been later. The last theater they had was the Sunset Drive-In. But the only competitor that the Cassidy family had over those years was my grandfather, Bart O'Laughlin, who was a performer, had a lot of history in performing in tent shows and vaudeville shows across Midwest. And so he bought a theater. He was settling down in life, and he bought the Mecca Theater, which was originally owned by the Cassidy family. In 1921, Cassidy's had the Mecca, and then they built the Frolic Theater in downtown Midland, which was there for a long time, and my grandfather bought the Mecca. The thing he did that was very amazing was he got the Paramount film contract. Paramount was the film company of the 1920s. They had Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford and Rudolph Valentino and Harold Lloyd, all these great stars. And so he had a great product to put on the screen.
Do you know how he did that? How he made contact with Paramount and persuaded them, especially against the Cassidys?
Yeah, I'm not certain how that all happened. I'm guessing the Cassidys had other contracts.
I see.
And he picked up Paramount. And it was a great coup for him. And not only that, he had Bart's orchestra. He had an 11-piece orchestra that played on the weekends. And he used...
At the theater?
Oh, yeah.
Between shows or in lieu of shows?
As an opener for the show. On weekends often. And he would do live theatrical performances because he directed theater all over the area. And one of his theater productions that he did at the Mecca Theater featured Alden Dow in the lead, of all people.
Tell me about that.
Well, Alden Dow was right out of high school, and he played this role. Dan was the name of the role, and I guess it was a big success. But my grandfather was...
Excuse me, do they have a film of that?
No. This is all live theater. No, I wish we did. And you know, I had a chance to meet Alden Dow in the 1970s, and I delivered a documentary on his life. And we gave him a copy. It was on VHS tape in those days. And I gave him the copy, and I was invited to sit in the living room, and I was very young, you know. I was pretty green.
That was big.
You know, I don't even think I was 25 years old. And I'm talking with Alden Dow about this documentary, and it was a very cordial conversation, having no idea that 55 years earlier, Alden Dow had worked with my grandfather on a production.
How did you find out about that?
Well, same way you start digging through newspaper records, and you're saying, oh my gosh, I didn't know this. How amazing is this? Because it was promoted in the newspaper, and they reviewed it in the Midland, wasn't the Midland Daily News then, it was the Midland Republican or whatever it was called.
Yeah.
And so that's how you learn. Well, to get back to Tim McCoy.
Yes.
The biggest film my grandfather showed in his home was called The Covered Wagon. And this was a huge film by Paramount. And it was the film that saved the Western in cinema. It was known for that. Do you remember the Titanic in the late 1990s? How big that huge
I didn't see it, but I remember.
It was the James Cameron film. Well, the the Covered Wagon was similar in terms of scope and size. It was a big epic production, and Western production, and it featured real Native American Indians in it for the first time ever. So this film in Midland turned away, on average, 400 people a night.
Wow.
They filled the seats. They had literally people sitting in the aisles to watch this film, and they were coming in from all over. It was just a smash success.
Excuse me, do you have any idea of the number of people who sat, seats there were in the Mecca?
I think there was about 500-ish.
That's a lot for the town of that size.
Yeah, it wasn't bad. Yeah. Frolic, I believe, was bigger.
10% of the town, yeah.
Yeah, when you think of the size of the town. But everybody went to the movies in those days, usually a couple times a week. There was no radio. There was no television. Certainly no internet.
Was it like 1 or 2 performances a day or more?
I think it was on weekends for sure, 3 performances. So he would turn people away by the hundreds when that film was shown. And you know how he announced the film to the public?
I do not.
Well, they always had the posters, which is how I got interested in posters. But he rang Bart's bell 5 minutes before the film was to start. It was just like a cowbell or something. And he rang this bell, and that's how everyone downtown, well, show's going to start in 5 minutes. So I got reading about, what is this film, The Covered Wagon? And I wanted to know more about it. And then I find, well, this guy from Saginaw was the technical director on the film. I said, this guy from Saginaw, 20 miles away, had a role in this film? Well, he was the one that brought Native American Indians, to the screen. And the story behind that, do I have a moment to tell that?
Absolutely. I'm thinking, are they Chippewa? What are they?
Well, he was out in Cheyenne, Wyoming.
Oh.
He was, this is Tim McCoy, left home at 17 with a few dollars in his pocket and said, I'm going west. He didn't tell any of his family, didn't tell a single friend, and he says, I'm just going west. He didn't know where he was going west, and he ended up in Lander, Wyoming, and he worked his way up. He became a ranch hand, and then he was in rodeos, and the next thing you know, he's a rancher. He enters World War I at an older age. He was 27 when he enlisted, and he didn't see action, but he came out a lieutenant colonel. And he then was titled Brigadier General and went to Cheyenne and had a government job, and he was working with Native Americans. The thing that was amazing to me, there's 2 things that are amazing about Tim McCoy that I think you would appreciate. One, he was always respectful to everybody.
Yes, I like that.
And he was extremely respectful. And 2, he had endless curiosity. Through his whole life, he was always changing and making differences. And that's why I liked him so much, because he was always willing to take a chance. Now, with Native Americans, when he went out in Wyoming, he saw a lot of them. And he was curious, because they would talk to each other in their own language, but they didn't have a great like for the white person, if you will. So he started learning their language, first in sign language. And he would greet them in sign language, and they couldn't believe it, that someone would do that. Then he became friends, and he got invited to their ceremonies, and he learned to speak their language. He learned their customs. And by the time he was 30 years old or so, he believed that Native Americans, he used the term brother. They are my brother. He felt that way about the men and women of those tribes.
Which were Cheyenne.
Yes, out of Cheyenne,
Right.
and Lander, and where he lived out there. Now, he was a big cattle rancher, and he was not a poor person. He did very well when he went out there. So when Paramount wanted to make The Covered Wagon, they said, we want to make this authentic. We want real Native American Indians in this production as the wagon, this is the story of the wagons went east to west. We want real Native Americans in there. There was only one person in the country they could go to make that happen, Tim McCoy.
How did they know that? A rancher?
Well, he was now negotiating treaties and things with Washington. He would help them. He would assist Washington, D.C. and the government. And he had the reputation for always being fair and honest with Native Americans. So Paramount came out to him, to Cheyenne, and had this meeting and said, we would like you to be the technical director for this film. Now, you're going to have to leave your job, but this is what we're willing to offer, to pay Native American Indians, which was about 2 or 3 times what their life, what their annual earnings would be, their income would be. It was great money for Native Americans. And Tim McCoy thought about it for about 30 seconds and said, yes.
Right.
He says, I'll do it. And so he left his government job and he went to work for Paramount to help put this film together. And he got about 400 to 500 Native American Indians to be in this film.
That's big.
Well,
travel alone.
Yeah, this film is really, really expensive, and they went 8 times over budget in the making of the film. Could you imagine Dow or GM or Dow Corning when it was, them going 8 times over budget on a project?
No.
Paramount was so excited about this project they didn't care. So they shot the film. James Cruz shot the film, and it got huge publicity, and it was not only a big success in the United States, it was huge worldwide. It was one of the 8 most biggest grossing films of the decade of the 20s. It was just a giant film. And no one's really seen this film in years. They had pieces, most of those films, 80% of those films have been lost forever from the 1920s. And much of the Covered Wagon they thought was lost too. However, last summer, they pieced together and it came out on Blu-ray and DVD.
Oh my goodness.
I couldn't believe it. And
You're probably thrilled.
I couldn't stand it. That's the first thing I did was I went out and ordered it. And silent films aren't real big in this area, but you go to the East or West Coast, silent films are still pretty big. The Museum of Modern Art shows them, and other places in New York, for example, show them. And so I couldn't believe it. I was so excited to see this film. And there's 6 minutes in the film that the film was lost, but they covered it with stills, publicity stills, and so it works. You get to see the film for the first time, and it's in really remarkable condition.
And what's the story that they tell?
Oh, it's a melodrama. It wasn't considered a great film, but it's basically the story of a wagon train going west. And the story's been told. Yeah, it's been told so many different ways. But this was one of the early versions. But
did he have an acting role in it or not?
No.
He had a producing role or an organizing role.
He worked exclusively with the Native Americans. And what made this film significant, what made Tim McCoy significant, is Tim McCoy is considered the one that opened the door for Native Americans to go into the motion picture industry. This guy from Saginaw. And so McCoy did a prologue when the film was shown, out on the East and West Coast, where he would come out on stage and he'd come out with Native Americans and they'd talk about Native American culture. They took that group over to Europe, and this was a huge deal because these Native Americans have never traveled like that.
Right.
And but they trusted Tim, and so they went by ship, and they performed before the Queen. It was a smash, absolute international smash, and McCoy actually owned a home over there in England for about a year, and that's the story. And so McCoy says, well, he was a very good-looking man, and he says, and he was articulate. His father was police chief of Saginaw, and so there's 2 things interesting about his youth. His father was a very intelligent man and had a big library. And so Tim McCoy loved to read about the Old West and that kind of thing. And his father, who was also named Timothy, Irish Catholic family, would not allow him to read these dime store books about the Great West. He wanted Tim McCoy to read great literature. But he would find adventure stories out of his library, great literature. So Tim McCoy has great facility with the spoken word and the written word, and he read his whole life. That's number 1. Number 2, Tim McCoy was comfortable around guns. This family had them. Being the police chief,
yes.
He was just
everybody had guns.
Yeah, they did, and especially that family. So he was comfortable. So McCoy, now he's out. He finishes this film, and he's thinking, well, maybe I could do some films. Why not me? I mean, he could really ride a horse. He didn't have to be trained. He was in rodeos. He could do
rodeos
stunts.
Are tough. Yeah.
And so next thing you know, he joins MGM. He's one of their 8 biggest stars. His office is right across the hall from Lon Chaney Sr. And when he started making these silent films, Joan Crawford was the heroine in one of his or 2 of his films. Joan Crawford, who went on to great success.
Yeah.
And but he did 16 films, all of them lost. Not
Lost?
One,
oh.
Not one survived.
How disappointing.
Not one survived. And
I'm sure they'll find it.
You know, they might still. It happens all the time.
Yes, it's in someone's trunk somewhere.
That's exactly what happens. You're so right.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happened with the Covered Wagon. Pieces of it were in someone's trunk. So he left MGM and then went to Universal and made the first talking serial Western. Serial meaning that was episodic, and they would show it 1 week, they would show one segment, and the next
And how long were these segments?
Some of them were 15, 16 segments, you know, so it would go on for 3 months.
And it'd be a half-hour program, or?
It was a warm-up to the film. I'm guessing it was more like 10 minutes, 15. And he made the first serial talking Western at Universal, because the Western was the last genre of film that went to sound. And the reason was they didn't shoot on sound stages. They had to shoot out in the open plains and out in the hills.
How interesting, yes.
And that was very difficult. That was the last part that they mastered in the film industry. So McCoy, now let's see, 1932 he joins Columbia, and that's when his career really takes off. 32, he made 32 films with Columbia. 32, he would have been like 40 years old when he was, when his career really took off. And that's where he made his best films. John Wayne was a co-star in one of his films, and you see the credits. Tim McCoy in whatever the film was with John Wayne.
Right.
John Wayne became a superstar.
Yes, he did.
And but McCoy's he loved live performing, more than films actually. And while he was at Columbia, he became the star performer at Ringling Brothers Barnum Bailey Circus
in Sarasota. Or traveling.
He traveled nationwide, and he was their closing act. And people said, when you saw...
What did he do, horse riding? What would he do?
Horse riding was part of it, because his horsemanship was so great. He had a whip that he could snap and take a cigarette out of your mouth.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and
Wow.
he demonstrated his gun shooting ability. He, on film, is recorded as having the fastest draw, in other words, pulling the gun out of the holster, the fastest draw of any cowboy in cinema history. And that's one of the things you look for when you look for a Tim McCoy
Show
film.
that at the police academy.
Yeah. And so he, anyways, he was very successful, and he was at Ringling Brothers while he was doing films. And then, this is what I like about Tim McCoy. He loved the Wild West shows, and he says, I'm going to start my own Wild West show.
And what did that encompass, a Wild West show?
It encompassed usually a couple hundred performers, including Native Americans in the show. Wild Bill Cody, or Buffalo Bill, is the one that was the most famous for those shows. He had 600 performers in his show. They came to town. They came to Saginaw in 1899. This massive show came to Saginaw, and Tim McCoy, that's where Tim McCoy's fire got lit for doing these shows. He was enthralled. And because his father was the police chief, his father got him in to meet Buffalo Bill Cody. And they met in the tent one-on-one, and Tim was so excited about it, he ran a broomstick, he and his friends, across the streets of Saginaw for the next 2 weeks.
Oh, but of course I'm sort of technically minded somewhat. I'm saying, where did these people sleep? How did they provision for them? 600 people in a traveling show. How did they move them about? How did Tim McCoy do it when he did it?
They had tents and they had cars. It was just like setting up a fair or a fairground, that kind of a thing. Well, McCoy's show lasted 3-4 months, and he lost his money. The problem was he started it up during the Great Depression. His timing was bad.
Yeah.
And it cost him his entire life savings.
Oh, what a tragedy.
All the money he made from his films, everything, it cost him just about everything, and he had to go back to square one. But what I like about Tim McCoy, he didn't lose sleep about it. He didn't grouse too much about it. He just went on and rebuilt his career.
With doing what?
Well, he continued in films for several more years, but he was really, when World War II hit in 1940, now he would have been in his late 40s, maybe 50, and he ran for senator and narrowly lost. He ran on the Republican ticket, and lost by...
From California or not?
He was actually in Wyoming.
Wyoming.
And he ran and lost by an eyelash. And then he said, well, I'm going to enlist in the Army. And he, because he felt he didn't get to see military duty in World War I. So he came back and he saw action in World War II. And the young soldiers that were with him in his troop, he was lieutenant colonel there too, and they couldn't believe, gosh, I'm with Tim McCoy, the cowboy star. And McCoy felt if I could do all these stunts in Western movies, I could surely still be a soldier, even though I'm 51 years old. And he did serve, and he served as many actors did,
yes.
And performers did during that time. And when he came back out, he was now in his 54 years old. This is what I like about Tim McCoy. Time to start something new again. And he built on his fame as a circus performer. He did not go back to films. And he traveled in little tent shows, and he performed in Clio, Michigan. He performed in Bay City. When he was 80, he performed in Bay City. He performed up to the age of 83. He performed for 30 years in tent shows. And he was the star attraction. And he performed in Mount Pleasant. And I'm certain he had to have performed in Midland, Michigan. He was all around the area.
But with his whip and horse tricks, how could you, I guess you build a act out of that?
He had an act, and he also did the Native American sign language. He talked about their culture and sign language. And he performed until he was 83 years old. And he had outlived his second wife, Inga was his wife, and she passed away. When she passed away, and then he started having back problems. At 83, he didn't feel he could ride the horse and look regal on the horse as he did.
Look well.
Yeah, and so that's when he quit performing. But he never stopped traveling. And he wrote his autobiography at the end of his life and traveled endlessly. Those last 2 or 3 years of his life, he traveled, and then heart failure claimed him.
What a life.
He never stopped doing new things. His whole life, he was experimenting, he was traveling, he was exploring his entire life. And even when he was performing and going from city to city, he would check off these battleground places, Civil War battleground locations where his father, his father was in the Civil War, although not an active fighter. He was with the Union. But he was interested in American history, and so he would do this history thing while he was performing. But he never stopped exploring his entire life, right to the end. And that is the thing I admire it most about Tim McCoy.
And how have you been inspired by him in your own life?
I never stopped doing new things.
And what are the new things you're seduced by now?
Well, doing programs about history. And I've gotten involved in history programs that I've presented in Saginaw, in Midland, and other places. And I did Tim McCoy's 125th anniversary. I did a really nice exhibit.
Interesting.
Which was 2 years ago, and I did a couple of talks. I did a few talks.
Now, you had a varied career at Dow Corning. How did that curiosity play out there? What did you learn from your various activities? Because they ranged wide.
I did a lot at Dow Corning. I was there 26 years, but I also did other things too. I wrote for newspapers at the same time. I published over 1,000 articles in newspapers while I was working before at Dow Corning, while I was at Dow Corning. And I had a wonderful experience at Dow Corning. We started the Dow Corning Visiting Artists series in that time.
Affiliate artists.
It was with affiliate. We partnered with affiliate artists.
Because they were part of Matrix for a long time, for 8 years or something.
Right, but then affiliate artists didn't last.
No, they did not.
We went then 7 years beyond that with, but the program was called the Dow Corning Affiliate Artists Series, and the artists we brought in in the early days. And it was a wonderful experience because it showed young people, it gave them a global, exposure to some of these artists.
Then you were involved in the breast implant.
Yes. That started for me in 1984 and went right to the end of my career. And that was very stressful. There were like 19,000 lawsuits against the company. The media was extensive. And, you know, not to get into too much detail, but my personal life, and my wife Sandy knows this, I could not go any place for several years without being asked about it. You go into a restaurant, go into a hardware, I mean, wherever, people would come up to you. They saw me on, you know, I do 25 interviews at the peak. You might do 25 interviews in a day. And,
Wow.
But that's at the very peak. It wasn't like that most of the time. And there were other people. I wasn't the only person involved. There were several Dow Corning people involved, very good people. I was just part of a team. But it was, because I was there from the beginning, people would come up and ask me about it in public. And so it did infiltrate, if you will, my personal life deeply. And I was talking about it all the time, it seemed like. So, but it was a great experience. Dow Corning is a great company, and that was a very difficult issue. It really affected the company from 1990 till when they filed for Chapter 11 in '92. It was hard on all employees, and the employees there were great.
There are hard times in life.
Yeah, that was a very difficult situation, and Dow Corning felt they had science on their side, and they partnered with a number of organizations to prove the science was not caused by silicones, and eventually it kind of came out that way, but they still had to set up a pool of funds to address the lawsuits that were out there. We won our first lawsuit, but there were so many lawsuits to litigate all of them. It just didn't make sense. It's a difficult situation.
Terrible. I want to thank Scott for his wonderful interview to McCoy, and the power of curiosity and to deal with change and setback that inspired him in his life. We are all inspired negatively or positively with who we run into or what we read. So choose wisely who inspires you, and try to be a good person who factors in curiosity through all your life. Remember, go out, do something kind for someone you know and someone you don't know, and do it every day because it might help. And you'll like it better. And thank you again, Scott, for being part of things.
Thank you for having me.
Just wonderful.
To contact Junia, send her an email at juniadownsthespark@gmail.com. For more information, program schedules, and news about future guests, go to www.juniadownthespark.com. Thank you for joining us. See you next time on Junia Doan's The Spark.
Local productions on QTV are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.